The master's wife begged the young slave to stay the night, and what happened next would shatter their world forever. In the shadows of a plantation house, a desperate request broke the rigid boundaries of power and submission. What began as a forbidden alliance would spiral into a chain of events that would leave blood on the ground, and nothing as it once was. The truth behind closed doors would change everything forever. Eleanor Blackwood stood at the window of her lavish bedroom, her trembling fingers clutching the curtains as she watched her husband's carriage disappear down the long driveway. The moment the dust settled behind the wheels, her shoulders sagged with momentary relief. "Isaac," she whispered urgently to the young slave, who had been polishing the silver in the corner. "I need you to stay in the house tonight." Isaac froze, the cloth still pressed against the ornate candelabra. Staying in the main house overnight was forbidden for male slaves, a transgression punishable by whipping or worse. "Mrs. Blackwood, if the master finds out he won tea, return until tomorrow evening," Eleanor interrupted, her voice cracking. "But they might come tonight. I've heard them planning." Isaac's eyes widened as understanding dawned. The neighboring plantation owner and his sons, brutal men who had been eyeing Eleanor since her husband's gambling debts, became common knowledge. "They said they would pay me a visit while Charles is away," she continued, her aristocratic composure crumbling. "I have no one else to turn to." The unspoken truth hung between them. She, the master's wife, was begging him, a slave, for protection. The world turned upside down in that moment. "Please," she whispered, something Isaac had never heard from her lips before. Isaac knew the cost if he was discovered. Death would be a mercy compared to what Master Blackwood would do. But as he looked at Eleanor's terrified face, he made his decision. "I'll stay, ma'am." But what neither of them realized was that this one night would forever alter the delicate power balance that kept the plantation's dark secrets buried. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 9 as Eleanor paced the drawing room, jumping at every creak and rustle from outside. Isaac stood by the window, his tall frame partially hidden behind the heavy curtains as he kept watch on the moonlit grounds. "They won tea come until after midnight," Isaac said quietly, his eyes never leaving the road. "That's when they think the house will be asleep." Eleanor stopped pacing. "How do you know that?" A moment of tension stretched between them. Isaac had said too much. "I hear things, ma'am," he finally replied. "The master's guests talk freely when they think no one important is listening." Eleanor studied him with new eyes. For 3 years, Isaac had worked in their household, always quiet, always observant. She had barely noticed him before tonight, just another piece of property in her husband's collection. "What else?" "Do you hear?" she asked, moving closer. Isaac hesitated, weighing his words carefully. "I know about the debts, ma'am, about the plantation being mortgaged to Mr. Hargrove, about the missing funds from the tobacco shipments." Eleanor's face paled. "Charles would kill you if he knew you possessed such knowledge, just as he would kill me for being here tonight," Isaac replied evenly, "or for knowing that you have been hiding letters from your sister in Boston, the ones planning your escape." The revelation hung in the air between them. Eleanor's hand flew to her throat, her eyes wide with shock. "How did you? I can read, Mrs. Blackwood," Isaac said simply. "Another secret that would cost me dearly." Understanding dawned in Eleanor's eyes. They now held equal power to destroy each other. The mistress with her social authority to condemn a slave on her word alone. The slave with dangerous knowledge that could ruin her husband and expose her planned betrayal. "It seems we both have reasons to keep secrets," she whispered. Isaac nodded slowly. "It seems we do." As night fell across the plantation, the true test of their dangerous arrangement was about to begin. Just past midnight, the sound of horses approaching broke the tense silence. Eleanor's hands trembled as she extinguished the oil lamp, plunging the drawing room into darkness. Isaac moved swiftly to her side, his voice barely audible. "3 riders, just as I feared Hargrove and his sons. The crunch of boots on gravel," confirmed his assessment. Eleanor's breath caught as raucous laughter drifted through the night air. "What do we do?" she whispered, clutching unconsciously at Isaac's arm. "The back stairs," Isaac replied. "To your chambers. Lock the door." Eleanor hesitated. "And leave you to face them alone?" "Better me than you, Ma am," Isaac said grimly. "If they find you a loud pounding on the front door, cut him off." "Mrs. Blackwood," a slurred voice called out. "We know you were alone tonight. Just want to discuss some business with you." More laughter followed, then the sound of glass breaking. Were forcing their way in through the side window. "No time," Isaac whispered, pulling Eleanor toward the servant-tass passage. "This way." They moved silently through the dark corridor. As the intruders stumbled into the foyer below, their heavy footsteps echoing through the house. Come out, wherever you are," the youngest Hargrove called, his voice thick with whiskey and malice. In the narrow passage, Eleanor and Isaac pressed against the wall, barely breathing. They were trapped between the approaching men and the Master's bedroom, a room Isaac was forbidden to enter under any circumstances. "If they find us together," Eleanor whispered. Isaac met her gaze in the darkness. "Then we both have everything to lose." The sound of breaking furniture downstairs spurred them to action. They slipped into the Master's study, the one room with a lock and a loaded pistol in the desk drawer. As Isaac secured the door, Eleanor retrieved the weapon with shaking hands. "Do you know how to use that?" Isaac asked, eyeing the pistol. Eleanor checked the chamber with surprising competence. "Charles insisted I learn. One of the few useful things he ever taught me." Footsteps thundered up the main staircase. They were out of time. Behind the desk, Isaac instructed. "If they break through, aim for the center of the chest." As they took their positions, a new understanding passed between them. Tonight, the boundaries of master and slave, of white and black, had dissolved in the face of a common enemy. Tonight, they were simply two people fighting to survive. The door handle rattled violently. "Mrs. Blackwood," called Hargrove Sr., his voice deceptively gentle. "We know you were in there. Your husband owes us, and we've come to collect one way or another." Eleanor's finger tensed on the trigger, as Isaac prepared to defend them both. What happened next would change everything forever. The door splintered at the hinges as Hargrove's eldest son threw his weight against it. Isaac moved swiftly, positioning himself between the breaking door and Eleanor, his tall frame casting a protective shadow in the dim lamplight. The heavy mahogany desk offered little barrier against what was coming, but Isaac's mind raced through their limited options. "One more!" shouted a voice from the hallway, followed by the sound of bodies preparing for another assault. Eleanor gripped the pistol tighter, her knuckles white against the polished handle. The weapon had belonged to her father, a reminder of a gentler life before her marriage to Charles Blackwood. She had never imagined she might need to use it. With a final crash that sent splinters flying across the Turkish carpet, the door gave way. 3 figures stumbled into the study. Hargrove Sr., flanked by his 2 sons, their faces flushed with alcohol and anticipation. The lamplight caught the gleam of a knife in the younger son's belt. Well, Hargrove drawled, straightening his waistcoat as his eyes narrowed at the sight of Isaac. "What have we here? The lady of the house entertaining company while her husband is away? How very progressive of you, Mrs. Blackwood." The implication hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn with indignation, but she kept her composure, years of Southern gentility training impossible to shed even in this moment of crisis. "Get out," Eleanor commanded, stepping forward with the pistol raised. Her voice carried the authority of generations of plantation mistresses, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "This is still Blackwood property, and you are trespassing." The younger Hargrove son, William, laughed a harsh sound that reminded Eleanor of Charles at his cruelest. "Not for much longer. Your husband signed it all away last night, traded it for his worthless life after he couldn't match father's hand. 5 aces," the elder Hargrove added with a smirk. "Remarkable luck." Isaac remained silent, calculating their odds against 3 men. He knew the Hargroves brutal in business and worse in their treatment of slaves. The oldest son, Thomas, had a reputation that made even the overseers uncomfortable. 2 slaves had died under his supervision last summer, Their backs flayed open for some minor infraction. No charges were ever brought. The study felt smaller by the second, the air heavy with tension and the lingering smell of gunpowder from the loaded pistol. Outside, an owl called into the night a sound that would normally bring comfort but now seemed like a mournful warning. The lady said, "Leave." Isaac finally spoke, his deep voice steady despite the danger. He had positioned himself so that he could lunge in any direction if needed, his muscles tense beneath his worn cotton shirt. Thomas Hargrove's face contorted with rage. "The slave speaks? You forget your place, boy." He spat the last word like a curse, his hand moving to the riding crop tucked into his belt. "I know exactly where I stand," Isaac replied, not backing down. In this moment, with death or worse hanging in the balance, the usual pretense of subservience seemed pointless. Eleanor felt a strange pride mingling with her terror. In all her years as mistress of Blackwood Plantation, she had never truly seen the people who served her not until tonight, when one man's courage might be all that stood between her and unspeakable fate. Hargrove Sr. stepped forward, seemingly amused by the standoff. Unlike his sons, he maintained a veneer of civility that made him all the more dangerous. His reputation for ruthless business dealings had made him the wealthiest planter in 3 counties. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his tone almost paternal, "put down that gun before you hurt yourself. We've merely come to inform you that your circumstances have changed. Your husband has transferred ownership of this plantation and everything on it to satisfy his debts." "You are lying," Eleanor whispered, though doubt crept into her voice. Charles had gambled away her mother's jewelry last spring. Why not the plantation itself? "Am I?" Hargrove reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, the wax seal of the county clerk visible even from across the room. Legal and binding, signed before witnesses. The Blackwood Plantation, its holdings, crops, and— his eyes slid to Isaac. "Property now belonged to me." Eleanor's hand trembled, but she kept the pistol leveled. The enormity of what Hargrove was suggesting washed over her, not just homeless, but penniless woman with no family, no means, and no protection in a world that offered few options for those in her position. Charles would never, she said, but the conviction had drained from her voice. The same husband who had struck her for spilling wine on a dinner guest would absolutely sacrifice her future to save his own skin. "Your husband lost more than money at the tables last night." Thomas Hargrove sneered, taking a step closer. The floorboard creaked beneath his boot. He lost his nerve. When father offered him a way out full debt forgiveness in exchange for the plantation and couldn't he sign fast enough. Even laughed about it, said you'd be better off without him anyway. William Hargrove chuckled. "Suggested we might find you accommodating, given the right incentives." Eleanor felt sick. The pistol suddenly seemed heavier in her hand. The distance between herself and the Hargroves, insurmountable, despite the small space. "And what of me?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the pounding of her heart. "That's why we were here," Hargrove Sr. said smoothly, taking another step forward. His cologne expensive sandalwood and tobacco filled the space between them. "To offer you accommodation. You can remain as our guest until arrangements are made for your future. My youngest son has always admired you from afar. Perhaps a new arrangement could be beneficial for all parties." William's smile widened, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. His eyes traveled over Eleanor's figure with naked hunger. The implication hung heavy in the air. Eleanor would be at their mercy a fate possibly worse than the poverty that awaited her otherwise. "The lady isn't going anywhere," Isaac stated firmly. His voice had changed, carrying a dangerous edge that Eleanor had never heard before. Thomas Hargrove's patience snapped. "You don't dictate terms, slave," he snarled, advancing with his hand raised. "When we leave here tonight, you will be wearing irons if you leave at all." He lunged forward, reaching for the pistol. Eleanor stumbled backward, colliding with the bookcase behind her. A volume of Shakespeare's sonnets, her mother's parting gift, tumbled to the floor as she struggled to maintain her grip on the weapon. In the confusion, Thomas's fingers closed around the barrel. yanking it toward himself. Eleanor's finger, still on the trigger, tightened reflexively. The gunshot exploded in the confined space of the study, deafening in its suddenness. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, as a thin cloud of smoke drifted toward the ceiling. Thomas Hargrove staggered backward, a look of shock on his face as crimson bloomed across his chest, staining his fine linen shirt. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but only a bubble of blood emerged. He collapsed to the floor with a heavy thud, his eyes still open but seeing nothing. For one heartbeat, nobody moved. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, oblivious to the tragedy unfolding within these walls. Then chaos erupted. Hargrove Sr. roared in anguish as his younger son dropped to his knees beside Thomas. "Tom, Tom, speak to me," William cried, pressing his hands uselessly against the wound that had already taken his brother's life. Isaac seized Eleanor S.'s arm, pulling her toward the servant S passage behind the bookcase, a secret escape route known only to the house slaves, built generations ago when the original Blackwood patriarch feared slave uprisings. "You've killed my son," Hargrove bellowed, his face contorted with grief and rage. The controlled businessman had vanished, replaced by a father consumed with vengeance. "I'll see you both hang for this. I'll hunt you to the ends of the earth." William Hargrove drew his knife, lunging toward them with a wordless cry of fury. Isaac kicked the heavy desk, sending it sliding into William's path. The young man stumbled, buying them precious seconds as Isaac pulled at the hidden lever disguised as a decorative molding. The bookcase swung outward, revealing the dark passage beyond. Eleanor hesitated for just a moment, the reality of what she was doing, fleeing with a slave, leaving behind everything she had ever known, momentarily overwhelming her. "Now, Mrs. Blackwood," Isaac urged, his voice cutting through her paralysis. As Isaac pushed the hidden panel closed behind them, the last thing they saw was Hargrove cradling his son's body, his eyes lifting to meet theirs with a promise of vengeance that would follow them to the ends of the earth. William struggled to his feet, knife still in hand, but the passage door clicked shut before he could reach them. Darkness enveloped them completely. The narrow corridor smelled of dust and secrets, the air cool and undisturbed for years. Eleanor could feel rough stone walls on either side as Isaac guided her forward, his hand firm on her elbow. "There are stairs ahead," he whispered. 15 steps down. Count them carefully." In the darkness of the narrow passage, Eleanor's breathing came in short gasps. The reality of what had just happened crashed over her like a wave. "I killed him," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I killed Thomas Hargrove." "It was an accident," Isaac replied, though they both knew that distinction would matter little to the law. He pulled the gun toward himself. "No court will believe that," Eleanor said, stumbling slightly on the uneven floor. "No court will believe anything we say." Isaac didn't contradict her. They both knew the truth of their situation, a white woman and a black slave, alone together at night, involved in the death of a prominent white man. There would be no justice, no fair hearing, only swift and terrible retribution. "We need to move," Isaac urged, guiding her down the pitch-black corridor. His voice was calm, but Eleanor could hear the tension beneath. "By dawn, every slave catcher in the county will be looking for us. Hargrove won't rest until he finds us both." They reached the bottom of the stairs, where Isaac paused. "There is a junction ahead. Left leads to the kitchens, right to the old smokehouse near the creek." "The creek," Eleanor decided immediately. "We need distance." They moved cautiously through the underground passage, built decades ago by slaves whose names had been forgotten, but whose craftsmanship might now save their lives. The air grew damper as they approached. "The creek side of the property. What will we do?" Eleanor asked, the enormity of their situation beginning to sink in. "Where can we possibly go?" "North," Isaac answered without hesitation. "To Philadelphia or beyond. I have connections. People who help runaways." Eleanor almost laughed at the irony that her salvation might lie in a network created to help slaves escape people like her. "Will they help me too, the mistress of a plantation?" Isaac was silent for a moment. "They help those in need," he finally said, "and tonight that includes you." The passage grew narrower, forcing them to move single file. Ahead, Eleanor could see the faintest glimmer of moonlight. The exit was near. "When we leave here," Isaac said quietly, "everything changes. You understand that?" Eleanor thought of her life at Blackwood Plantation, the loveless marriage, the isolation, the hollow performance of being the perfect Southern wife. She thought of the letters from her sister in Boston offering escape. She thought of the pistol in her hand and Thomas Hargrove's blood spreading across his chest. "Yes," she said with sudden clarity, "everything already has." The gunshot had changed everything. There would be no explaining, no justice for a white woman and a black slave involved in the death of a plantation owner's son. Their only hope was to Ronan to somehow stay alive long enough to reach the north. As they emerged into the cool night air behind the kitchen gardens, Isaac and Eleanor, Blackwood mistress and slave no longer, but fugitives bound by circumstance, faced the impossible road ahead. The quarter moon provided just enough light to see the path leading toward the creek, where the water might hide their scent from the tracking dogs that would surely come with dawn. Eleanor took one last look at Blackwood House, the only home she had known for 7 years. Light still blazed from the windows of the study, and she could imagine the scene unfolding within. Hargrove organizing a search party, William arming himself for vengeance, servants being roused and questioned. "We have perhaps a 2-hour head start," Isaac said, reading her thoughts. "We need to make it count." He offered his hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable just hours before. Eleanor hesitated only briefly before taking it, feeling the calluses earned from years of forced labor. Together, they slipped into the shadows of the oak grove, two unlikely allies against a world that would condemn them both. The true test of their unlikely alliance had only just begun. The creek ran cold and swift beneath the April moon, its surface rippling with silver light. Eleanor and Isaac moved along its edge, keeping to the shadows of overhanging willows. They had been traveling for nearly 3 hours, putting precious distance between themselves and Blackwood House. The night sounds, frogs calling, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush provided a strange, peaceful counterpoint to their desperate flight. "We need to cross soon," Isaac said, his voice low. "The dogs will follow our scent to the water's edge." Eleanor nodded, though the prospect filled her with dread. Her silk dress, already torn and muddied from their hasty journey through woods never meant for such finery, would become a sodden weight. But she didn't complain. Such concerns seemed trivial now. Just hours ago, she had been mistress of one of Virginia's most prosperous plantations. Now she was a fugitive, running for her life alongside a man she had legally owned. "How far until we reach a safe place?" she asked, wincing as another bramble caught at her hem. She disentangled it carefully, aware that every scrap of fabric left behind was a clue for their pursuers. Isaac paused, scanning the tree line with eyes accustomed to finding paths in darkness. The moonlight caught the strong lines of his profile, and Eleanor was struck by how little she had truly seen him before tonight. He had served in her household for 3 years, yet she realized she knew almost nothing about him, his thoughts, his dreams, his past. "There's a settlement of free blacks about 10 miles north," he finally replied. "People who might help us at least for tonight." The way he said us gave Eleanor pause. Until this moment she hadn't fully considered what it meant for Isaac to include her in his escape. He was risking not just recapture but certain death by helping her. "And they'll welcome me?" Eleanor couldn't keep the doubt from her voice. Why would people who had suffered under the institution she represented offer her sanctuary? "They'll welcome anyone I vouch for," Isaac replied with quiet confidence. A hint of pride colored his words, suggesting a standing in this community that Eleanor had never imagined. "But we need to move faster. The crossing is just ahead." The creek widened at a bend, forming a relatively shallow ford. Moonlight danced on the rippling water, illuminating the safest path across. Without hesitation, Isaac stepped into the water, his movements sure despite the current. He turned, offering his hand to steady Eleanor as she followed. The shock of cold made her gasp as water soaked through her thin slippers, but she pressed forward, lifting her skirts as the water rose to her knees, then her thighs. The weight of the sodden fabric pulled at her arms, already aching from the unfamiliar exertion of their flight. "Step exactly where I step," Isaac instructed, his voice gentle but firm. "The current is stronger in the middle, and there are deep pools to either side." Eleanor followed carefully, grateful for his guidance. Halfway across, where the water churned most vigorously, she slipped on a mossy stone, nearly falling before Isaac's strong grip steadied her. For a moment, their eyes met in the moonlight in acknowledgement of their strange new partnership, a silent communication that transcended the rigid boundaries that had previously defined their relationship. "Thank you," she whispered, the words carrying more weight than such a simple courtesy should bear. Isaac nodded once, his expression unreadable, before turning to lead her through the remaining stretch of water. On the far bank, they paused only long enough for Eleanor to wring out her skirts, the water running between her fingers and back to the creek. The night air felt even colder now against her wet clothing, but the exercise of walking soon warmed her. Isaac set a brisk pace, occasionally reaching back to help her over fallen logs or through particularly dense underbrush. "Tell me about these people we were going to meet," Eleanor said as they continued northward through a stand of pine trees. The soft carpet of needles beneath their feet muffled their footsteps, a small mercy that might help conceal their passage. Isaac seemed to weigh his words carefully, and Eleanor realized he was deciding how much to trust her with. The thought stung, though she understood it perfectly. "They were part of a network," he finally said. "People who believe in freedom." "The Underground Railroad," Eleanor said quietly. She had heard whispers, seen the fear in plantation owners' eyes when the subject arose at dinner parties. Charles had once participated in a patrol that caught a conductor leading 5 slaves north. The man had been hanged the next day. Isaac glanced at her, surprised. "Yes, though we don't use that name among ourselves. My sister in Boston is an abolitionist," Eleanor explained, ducking beneath a low-hanging branch. "Her letters, well, Charles would have been furious if he'd known what she wrote to me. She described the movement, the safe houses, the brave people risking everything to help others reach free states." "And what did you think of her letters?" Isaac asked, his tone carefully neutral. Eleanor considered the question. "I admired her conviction, her courage. But I was a coward. I never responded to those parts of her letters. I never took a stand. And now? Now I have no choice but to stand with those my husband would have condemned," she said softly. "Ironic, isn't it?" They walked in silence for a time, each lost in thought. The woods grew denser, the path less distinct. Occasionally, Isaac would stop, listening intently before choosing their direction. Eleanor realized he must have traveled this way before, perhaps guiding others to freedom. The thought of him slipping away from Blackwood Plantation under cover of darkness, risking whipping or worse to lead others to liberty, filled her with a complex mixture of emotions she couldn't fully untangle. "You've done this before," she said. It wasn't a question. Isaac's expression remained guarded, but something in his posture shifted, a subtle release of tension, as if relieved to have this truth acknowledged. "I've helped people find their way north. While living at Blackwood," he nodded. "For 3 years. Eleanor felt a strange mix of emotions, admiration for his courage, shame for her own obliviousness. How many nights had he slipped away while she slept in her comfortable bed, never questioning the system that kept him enslaved? How many desperate souls had found freedom because of the man who served her tea each morning, his face carefully composed to reveal nothing of his nighttime missions? "I never knew," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "That was the point, Mrs. Blackwood." A hint of wry humor colored his voice. "Eleanor," she corrected him, "I think circumstances have moved us beyond formalities." A ghost of a smile crossed his face, transforming his features in the dappled moonlight. "Eleanor, then." The sound of her name in his voice was spoken as an equal sent an unexpected shiver through her that had nothing to do with her damp clothing. For a moment, she glimpsed what it might be like to truly know this man as a person rather than as property. They continued in companionable silence until the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. The woods thinned, revealing a small valley dotted with modest cabins. Smoke rose from one chimney, a promising sign of early risers who might offer assistance. Isaac held up a hand, signaling Eleanor to wait at the edge of the trees. His posture had changed, alert to potential danger. "Stay here," he whispered. "Let me make sure it's safe." Eleanor pressed herself against the trunk of a large oak, making herself as inconspicuous as possible. From this vantage point, she could observe the small settlement without being seen. The cabins were simple but well-maintained, with small garden plots and a few chickens scratching in the dirt. It looked peaceful, ordinary yet. She knew the people living here existed in a precarious state, their freedom constantly threatened by slave catchers and unsympathetic authorities. Isaac whistled softly a pattern that mimicked a whippoorwill-esque call. After a moment, an answering whistle came from the nearest cabin. Eleanor watched as an elderly black man emerged, squinting in the pre-dawn light. He wore simple homespun clothing and carried himself with quiet dignity. "Wait here," Isaac instructed. "Let me make sure it's safe." Eleanor watched as Isaac approached the cabin cautiously. The elderly man stood his ground, arms crossed, as Isaac drew near. They spoke briefly, the old man glancing repeatedly in Eleanor's direction. Their conversation seemed tense, with the older man shaking his head several times. Finally, he nodded and gestured for Isaac to bring her forward. Eleanor stepped out from the shelter of the trees, conscious of how she must appear a white woman in a torn and muddied fine dress, her hair falling from its pins, her hands scratched from brambles. She approached slowly, trying to project humility rather than the authority she had been raised to assume. "This is Solomon," Isaac said, as Eleanor reached them. "He and his wife Martha have offered us shelter." Solomon sweathered. Face revealed little as he assessed Eleanor. His eyes, sharp despite his advanced years, seemed to look through her, weighing her worth beyond her appearance or station. "The mistress becomes the fugitive," he finally said, his voice deep with age and wisdom. "These are strange times indeed." "Thank you for your kindness," Eleanor said, fighting the urge to apologize for who she was, for what she represented. No apology could erase the system that had benefited her at the expense of people like Solomon. "Don't thank me yet," Solomon replied, glancing toward the brightening horizon. "The hard part's just beginning. Come inside before someone sees you." He led them to his cabin, opening the rough wooden door and ushering them inside with a quick glance around to ensure they weren't observed. The interior was simple but meticulously clean. A woman even older than Solomon stood by the hearth, stirring something that smelled wonderfully of cornmeal and molasses. Two narrow beds occupied one wall, a handmade quilt folded neatly on each. A small table with 4 chairs stood in the center of the room, a well-worn Bible resting upon it. "Martha," Solomon said, "our guests have arrived." Martha turned, her eyes sharp despite her age. She wore a plain dress and apron, her gray hair covered by a simple cap. She looked Eleanor up and down, taking in the fine fabric of her ruined dress, the delicate embroidery at the collar, the soft hands that had never known hard labor. "You will need different clothes," she said practically. "Those might as well be a sign saying reward money here." Eleanor nodded, suddenly conscious of how out of place she must appear. Her dress, even muddied and torn, was clearly that of a wealthy woman. "I'd be grateful for anything you can spare." Martha disappeared into a back room, returning with a bundle of simple garments. "These belonged to my daughter before she went north. They should fit well enough." "Thank you," Eleanor said, accepting the clothes with genuine gratitude. The fabric was coarse compared to what she was accustomed to, but clean and well mended. "You can change behind that screen," Martha indicated a wooden partition in the corner. "And we'll need to do something about that hair. Too distinctive." As Eleanor changed into the simple cotton dress and apron, she could hear the others speaking in low voices. Isaac was explaining what had happened, though she noticed he described the shooting as self-defense rather than an accident. Perhaps that distinction mattered less than the fact that Thomas Hargrove was dead by her hand. Hargrove won T rest until he finds them both, Solomon murmured. His kind Don T forgive. We just need to get them to Philadelphia, Isaac replied. Her sister will help from there. And you? Martha asked. What will you do once she's safe? There was a pause before Isaac answered. I haven't thought that far ahead. Eleanor's fingers fumbled with the unfamiliar fastenings of the dress. The clothing felt strange against her skin, coarser than anything she had worn since childhood, but also oddly liberating. The dress required no corset, no petticoats, no elaborate fastenings. When she emerged from behind the screen, Solomon nodded approvingly. Better, he said. Martha will. Help with your hair. Martha gestured for Eleanor to sit on a low stool by the fire. With efficient movements, she unbound Eleanor's elaborate coiffure, combing out the long auburn tresses that had been her pride since girlhood. The older woman's touch was gentle but practical, her fingers working through tangles caused by their flight through the woods. Such pretty hair, Martha murmured, but too noticeable. She produced a pair of shears from her apron pocket. May I? Eleanor hesitated only briefly before nodding. The snip of the scissors felt symbolic, somehow cutting away her old life with each lock that fell to the floor. Martha worked quickly, transforming Eleanor's crowning glory into a simple, practical style that barely reached her shoulders. There, Martha said, stepping back to assess her work. With a cap and bonnet, you will pass for a farmer's wife easily enough. Eleanor raised a hand to her shorn locks, feeling strangely light-net, as if the weight removed was more than just physical. She had never worn her hair short, not even as a child. Her mother had insisted that a lady's hair was her glory, to be displayed and admired but never cut. This small act of transformation felt more significant than the change of clothing. Isaac, who had been deep in conversation with Solomon, turned to look at Eleanor. Something in his expression, a flash of surprise followed by something warmer, made her cheeks flush with unexpected heat. We need to keep moving, he said, though. His eyes lingered on her transformed appearance. Solomon says there are already men searching the county roads. Hargrove has offered $500 for each of you, Solomon confirmed grimly. Dead or alive. Eleanor's stomach clenched. The reality of their situation, fugitives with a price on their head, shit her anew. $500 was more than many men earned in a year. The bounty would attract not just lawmen, but opportunists of every stripe. You will take the North Trail, Solomon continued, unfolding a rough map on the table. The paper was yellowed and creased, marked with symbols Eleanor didn't recognize. Martha has packed food. Travel by night when possible. The next safe house is here. He indicated a spot near the state line, marked with a small cross. Ask for Reverend Cooper. The password is Exodus. How will we cross the river? Isaac asked, studying the map intently. His finger traced the blue line representing the wide river that separated slave territory from free states. Cooper will arrange it. He has contacts among the boatmen. Solomon's finger traced their route northward. From there, you will head to Philadelphia. My cousin Daniel runs a boarding house on Christian Street. He can help you disappear. The enormity of the journey ahead left Eleanor momentarily speechless. Philadelphia was over 300 miles away, a distance that seemed impossible on foot, especially as fugitives hunted by men with horses and dogs. We should rest today, Isaac suggested, noting Eleanor's exhaustion. Travel tonight when it's safer. Solomon shook his head, his expression grave. Not here. Patrols will be checking every known free black settlement by midday. Martha's brother has a cellar room about 3 miles from here. You can rest there until nightfall. As Martha packed additional supplies into a small bundle, cornbread wrapped in cloth, dried apples, a small jar of preserved, Solomon took Isaac aside. Their conversation was too quiet for Eleanor to hear, but she could see the gravity in both men's expressions. Solomon pressed something into Isaac's hand, a small knife, Eleanor realized, which Isaac quickly tucked into his boot. When they finished their private conversation, Solomon clasped Isaac's shoulder in a gesture of solidarity that spoke of shared purpose and mutual respect. The easy familiarity between the two men suggested a deeper connection than chance acquaintance. You knew each other before, Eleanor said, the realization dawning. Before Blackwood. Isaac nodded. Solomon taught me to read years ago, before I was sold to your husband's estate. Eleanor absorbed this information, another piece of the puzzle that was Isaac's hidden life. Literacy among enslaved people was forbidden by law in Virginia, punishable by whipping or worse. That Isaac could read and that Solomon had taken the risk to teach him spoke volumes about both men's courage. "Ready?" Isaac asked, turning to Eleanor. She nodded, accepting the simple bonnet Martha offered. As she tied it under her chin, she caught a glimpse of herself in the small mirror hanging by the door. A stranger looked back at her, a plain woman in simple clothes, her hair shorn and her face bare of powder or rouge. For the first time in years, she saw herself without the trappings of her position. The transformation was startling. Without her fine clothes and elaborate hairstyle, she looked younger, more vulnerable, but also somehow more authentic. She wondered if this simpler version of herself might have been happier than the ornamental wife Charles Blackwood had required her to be. "Thank you," she said to Martha and Solomon, knowing the words were inadequate for the risk they had taken in sheltering them. If discovered, they would face severe punishment for aiding fugitives, especially fugitives accused of murder. Martha pressed something into her hand, a small cloth pouch tied with string. "Herbs," she explained, "for tea when your strength fails." And this she added, a tiny carved wooden figure, smooth with age and handling, for protection on the journey. Eleanor closed her fingers around the gifts, touched by the unexpected kindness. The wooden figure was warm against her palm, as if it carried some of Martha's own strength within it. "It was my grandmother S," Martha said softly, "brought with her from Africa. It has seen many journeys to freedom." The significance of the gift was not lost on Eleanor. That Martha would entrust such a precious family heirloom to her, a white woman, former mistress of enslaved people, moved her deeply. "I will treasure it," she promised, carefully tucking both gifts into the pocket of her borrowed dress. At the door, Solomon offered one final piece of advice. "Trust is a luxury you cannot afford," he said quietly. "Except with each other. Your lives now depend on that trust." He handed Isaac a small pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of coins. "It's not much, but it might buy silence if needed." Isaac accepted the money with a solemn nod. "I'll repay this debt. See that you live to do so," Solomon replied. "Now go, while the light is still gentle." With those words echoing in their minds, Eleanor and Isaac slipped out into the growing dawn. They kept to the shadows of the tree line, moving swiftly away from the settlement. In the distance, a church bell rang, marking the beginning of a new day. For Eleanor Blackwood, former mistress of a Virginia plantation, and Isaac, the man whose intelligence and courage she had failed to recognize for 3 years, it marked the beginning of a dangerous new chapter. Ahead lay hundreds of miles of hostile territory, populated by those who would return them to face justice or worse. Their only allies were each other, and a fragile network of strangers willing to risk everything for the cause of freedom. The path, Martha's brother had recommended, led them through a dense thicket of blackberry bushes, not yet in bloom, but already formidable, with thorns. Beyond lay a stretch of meadow that they would need to cross quickly, exposed to any watching eyes. "Stay low," Isaac instructed as they approached the open ground. "Follow the dip in the land where the grass is tallest." Eleanor did as directed, crouching awkwardly as she made her way through the dew-damp grass. Her muscles protested the unfamiliar position, but she pushed through the discomfort. Physical pain seemed a small price to pay for survival. Halfway across the meadow, Isaac suddenly froze, raising a hand in warning. Eleanor immediately dropped flat to the ground, her heart pounding. Through the swaying grass, she could just make out what had alarmed Isaac, the distant figure of a man on horseback, silhouetted against the rising sun. They lay perfectly still, barely breathing, as the rider paused at the edge of the meadow. He seemed to be surveying the landscape, perhaps searching for signs of passage. After what felt like an eternity, he turned his horse and continued along the road, unaware of the fugitives hiding mere hundreds of yards away. "Patrol?" Eleanor whispered when Isaac finally signaled it was safe to move. He nodded grimly. "The first of many. They'll have men watching every road and crossing from here to Maryland." They continued across the meadow with even greater caution, eventually reaching the safety of a stand of oak trees on the far side. The sun was fully up now, increasing their visibility and their danger, They needed to reach Martha S. Brother S. place before the day grew much older. "It's just beyond that rise," Isaac said, pointing to a low hill ahead. A small farm with a red barn. As they approached the farm, Eleanor was struck by its modest prosperity. A well-tended vegetable garden stretched behind the small house, and several healthy-looking cows grazed in a nearby pasture. A man was chopping wood in the yard, his rhythmic movements speaking of strength and purpose. Isaac whistled that same pattern he had used at Solomon Sand. The man looked up, shading his eyes against the morning sun. After a moment's hesitation, he set down his axe and approached them. "You must be Isaac," he said without preamble. "Solomon sent word you might be coming. I am Jeremiah." "This is Eleanor," Isaac said, simply offering no explanation for her presence. Jeremiah's eyes widened slightly at the sight of a white woman accompanying Isaac, but he asked no questions. "Come inside. My wife's at market, but she'll be back by noon." The farmhouse was similar to Solomon's in its simplicity, but with the added touches of a woman's hand curtains at the windows, a vase of early spring flowers on the table. Jeremiah led them to a trapdoor concealed beneath a rug in the kitchen. "Root cellar," he explained, lifting the heavy door. "Cool and dry, not comfortable, but safe. No one will look for you there." A ladder led down into darkness. Isaac descended first, then helped Eleanor down. The cellar was indeed cool and dry, with shelves of preserved vegetables and fruits lining the walls. A small window near the ceiling, covered with a grate, provided minimal light and air. "Rest here," Jeremiah said. "I'll bring food later. If anyone comes, stay silent no matter what you hear above." With that, he closed the trap door, leaving them in semi-darkness. Eleanor's eyes gradually adjusted to the dim light filtering through the small window. Isaac had already settled himself on the earthen floor, his back against a wall of shelves. "You should sleep," he suggested. "We have a long night ahead." Eleanor nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted she truly was. The events of the past 12 hours, the confrontation with the Hargroves, Thomas S. death, their desperate flight seemed almost dreamlike in their intensity. She found a relatively clean spot on the floor and sat down, arranging her skirts modestly around her. "Isaac," she said hesitantly, "may I ask you something?" He turned toward her, his expression guarded but not unwilling. "You may ask. Why did you help me? After what happened, you could have left me to face the Hargroves alone. It would have been easier for you to escape without me." Isaac was silent for so long that Eleanor thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "I've seen what men like Hargrove do to women in their power," he said quietly. "Even white women. I couldn't leave you to that." "But I was your owner," Eleanor pressed. "Part of the system. That kept you enslaved." Isaac's eyes, dark and unreadable in the dim light, studied her face. "You were never cruel," he said finally. "That counts for something in this world." "Not being cruel isn't the same as being kind," Eleanor replied, ashamed at how little that distinction had mattered to her before tonight. "No," Isaac agreed, "it's not. But it's a beginning." They fell silent, each lost in thought. The root cellar was cool but not uncomfortable, the earth beneath them soft with age. Despite her anxiety, Eleanor found her eyelids growing heavy. The rhythm of Isaac's breathing across from her was oddly comforting, a reminder that she was not alone in this strange new reality. As she drifted toward sleep, Eleanor thought of the wooden figure Martha had given her, still clutched in her hand. A talisman from another world, another tradition, carried across an ocean by people torn from their homes. How many hands had held it, drawing strength from its smooth contours? How many prayers had been whispered over it in languages Eleanor would never know? Her last conscious thought before sleep claimed her was a kind of prayer of her own, not to the stern God of her father's church, but to whatever forces might guide two unlikely companions safely through the dangers ahead. As she slept, Isaac watched over her, his mind working through the challenges that awaited them. The woman sleeping across from him bore little resemblance to the elegant mistress of Blackwood Plantation. With her hair shorn and dressed in simple clothes, she looked younger, more vulnerable and far more real than the ornamental figure who had poured tea in the plantation-esque grand dining room. He had told her only part of the truth about why he had helped her. Yes, he couldn't leave her to Hargrove's mercy, but there was more. In the moment of crisis, when Thomas Hargrove had fallen and chaos erupted, Isaac had seen something in Eleanor's eyes that resonated with his own experience, the sudden, vertiginous feeling of life irrevocably changing in a single heartbeat. He had known that feeling once before, as a boy of 12, when he was sold away from his mother and sisters, marched in chains to a new plantation where no one knew his name. He had recognized it in Eleanor's eyes, the terror and disorientation of having one's entire world destroyed in an instant. That recognition had forged an unexpected bond between them, transcending the vast gulf of race and station that had previously defined their relationship. Whether that bond would survive the journey ahead remained to be seen. As Eleanor slept fitfully on the cellar floor, Isaac kept watch, listening for any sound from above that might signal danger. The small knife Solomon had given him lay ready in his hand, a meager defense against the forces arrayed against them. But better than nothing. Outside, the sun climbed higher in the April sky, warming the earth and bringing with it increased danger, as search parties combed the countryside for the fugitives from Blackwood Plantation. Somewhere to the south, Hargrove was likely organizing a more systematic hunt, perhaps calling in favors from neighboring plantations to provide men and dogs. The odds against them were overwhelming. Yet, as Isaac watched Eleanor's chest rise and fall in the rhythm of sleep, he felt a curious sense of purpose. They would continue north when darkness fell, two unlikely allies against a hostile world. As they crested a small hill later that day, Eleanor paused to look back one last time at the world she had left behind. The setting sun illuminated the rolling Virginia countryside, beautiful and treacherous in equal measure. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay Blackwood Plantation, the only home she had known since her marriage 7 years ago. She would never see it again. "Are you having second thoughts?" Isaac asked, watching her carefully. Eleanor turned away from the view, facing north toward the unknown future that awaited them. The weight of Martha's wooden figure in her pocket reminded her of all those who had made this journey before her, under far worse conditions. "No," she said with newfound resolve. "Only forward thoughts now." Together, they continued their journey into the unknown, two unlikely companions bound by circumstance in the desperate hope of reaching freedom. The road ahead would test them in ways neither could imagine, forcing them to confront not only external dangers, but the deeply ingrained beliefs and assumptions that had shaped their lives until now. As darkness fell, they moved forward, step by step, into a future neither of them had chosen, but both now embraced, a future where the categories of master and slave, white and black, might eventually give way to the simpler, more profound recognition of shared humanity. For 3 nights, they traveled under cover of darkness, resting during daylight hours in whatever shelter they could find, an abandoned barn, a dense thicket, once even the root cellar of a burned-out homestead. The spring weather favored them, mild enough that they didn't suffer from exposure, though occasional rain left them damp and chilled. They spoke little during these journeys, saving their breath for the miles that stretched before them. Isaac set a pace that challenged Eleanor's endurance, but she never complained, understanding that every hour brought Hargrove's men closer to their trail. On the 4th night, they reached the property of Reverend Cooper, a small church nestled in a grove of ancient oaks near the Maryland border. A single candle burned in the window, the signal Solomon had told them to watch for. "Remember," Isaac murmured as they approached, "the password is Exodus." Eleanor nodded, her throat dry with apprehension. Each new contact increased their risk of betrayal, yet they had no choice but to trust the network that had guided countless others to freedom. They knocked softly on the church's side door. After a moment, it opened a crack, revealing the face of an elderly white man with kind eyes and a shock of silver hair. We seek shelter on our journey, Isaac said quietly. What journey might that be? The man asked, his voice gentle but cautious. Exodus, Eleanor replied, the word feeling strange on her tongue. The door opened wider. Come in quickly, the Reverend said, ushering them inside. You were expected. The church interior was simple but beautiful, with handcrafted wooden pews and a modest altar. A trapdoor behind the pulpit led to a small room beneath the church, a hiding place that had sheltered dozens of fugitives over the years. You will be safe here tonight, Reverend Cooper assured them, lighting a lantern that illuminated the underground room. Tomorrow night, we'll arrange your crossing. The river patrol? Isaac asked, his concern evident. Increased since news of your escape spread, Cooper confirmed. But we have friends among the boatmen. For tonight, rest. You look exhausted, both of you. He provided them with clean blankets and a simple meal of bread, cheese, and cold meat. Before leaving them to rest, he hesitated, studying Eleanor with curious eyes. You are not what I expected, he said finally. What did you expect, Reverend? Eleanor asked. Not the mistress of Blackwood Plantation, certainly. He smiled kindly. God works in mysterious ways. Sleep well. After he had gone, closing the trapdoor behind him, Eleanor and Isaac arranged their blankets on opposite sides of the small space. The room was cramped but clean, with a dirt floor and rough wooden walls. A small air vent provided fresh air from outside. Isaac, Eleanor said softly in the lantern light, what happens when we reach Philadelphia? He looked up from where he was spreading his blanket. Your sister will help you start a new life. As for me, he shrugged, I'll continue north, perhaps to Canada. Alone? The word escaped before Eleanor could consider its implications. Isaac's expression softened slightly. The journey we were sharing is temporary, Eleanor. Our paths will diverge once we reach free soil. She nodded, feeling strangely bereft at the thought. In just a few days, this man had become her only ally, her protector, her link to survival itself. The idea of continuing without him seemed impossible. Of course, she said, turning away to hide the unexpected emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. I understand. They extinguished the lantern and settled into an uneasy sleep, each aware of the other's presence in the darkness, each contemplating the uncertain future that awaited them beyond the river. Morning brought the sound of hymns from above, as the congregation gathered for Sunday service. Eleanor and Isaac remained hidden below, listening to the muffled singing and Reverend Cooper's passionate sermon about the Israelites' flight from Egypt. He's warning them, Isaac explained when Eleanor looked confused. The sermon is about us, about what's happening tonight. He's preparing those who will help. After the service ended and the congregation dispersed, Cooper brought them a more substantial meal and news that chilled Eleanor's blood. Hargrove's men crossed into Maryland yesterday, he said gravely. They're reoffering $1,000 now for information leading to your capture. The reward posters describe you both in detail. Eleanor's hand went instinctively to her shorn hair. Will tonight's crossing still be safe? As safe as it can be, Cooper replied. We've arranged for a boat shortly after midnight. The crossing point is 3 miles downstream where the river narrows. A guide will take you to Philadelphia from the northern bank. He hesitated, then added, There's something else you should know. The posters mention murder charges. They claim you killed Thomas Hargrove in cold blood during a robbery attempt. Isaac's expression darkened. That's a lie. It was self-defense. The truth matters little now, Cooper said gently. What matters is getting you safely across tonight. The boatmen will come to the church at 11. Be ready to move quickly. The hours passed with excruciating slowness. Eleanor tried to rest, knowing she would need her strength, but sleep eluded her. Instead, she found herself watching Isaac as he methodically checked and repacked their meager supplies. His movements were efficient, his expression focused. She wondered what thoughts occupied his mind. Are you afraid? She asked suddenly. Isaac paused, considering the question. Yes, he admitted, but fear can keep you alert, keep you alive. It's not always a bad thing. I've been afraid my entire life, Eleanor confessed. Afraid of disappointing my father, afraid of Charles S. Temper, afraid of ending up penniless and alone. She gave a small, humorless laugh. Now I've realized those fears. Not alone, Isaac corrected her quietly. Not yet, at least. The simple statement warmed her more than she cared to admit. At precisely 11 o'clock, the trapdoor opened. Reverend Cooper descended the ladder, followed by a burly man with a weathered face and calloused hands, clearly the boatman they had been waiting for. "This is Micah," Cooper introduced him. "He'll take you across tonight." Micah nodded curtly. "We need to move." The patrol changed their schedule. I'll be passing the crossing point at 1 instead of 2. We need to be across before then. They gathered their few possessions and followed Micah out into the night. A light rain had begun to fall, obscuring visibility, a blessing in disguise. They moved silently through the church graveyard and into the woods beyond, following a path barely visible in the darkness. The journey to the crossing point took nearly an hour, the path muddy and treacherous in the rain. Twice they froze at the sound of voices in the distance, but the danger passed each time. Finally, they reached the river bank, where a small rowboat waited, half hidden among the reeds. "The river s running high with the spring rains," Micah warned, as they prepared to embark. "Stay low in the boat and don't make a sound, no matter what happens." Eleanor stepped carefully into the rocking craft, settling on the damp wooden seat. Isaac followed, his weight causing the boat to dip alarmingly. Micah pushed them off from shore with practiced ease, his powerful arms working the oars silently against the current. The river stretched before them, a dark expanse separating slavery from freedom. On the far shore lay Maryland, still a slave state, but closer to the Mason-Dixon line and the free states beyond. Eleanor stared into the darkness, trying to make out the opposite bank, but could see nothing through the rain and mist. Halfway across, disaster struck. A beam of light cut through the darkness from downstream, a patrol boat, moving faster than expected. Micah cursed under his breath, pulling harder on the oars. "Get down," he hissed. "Flat in the boat, both of you." Eleanor and Isaac complied immediately, pressing themselves against the damp bottom of the craft. The patrol boat's lantern swept across the water, coming dangerously close to illuminating their position. "River Patrol," a voice called out. "Show yourself." Micah stopped rowing, but didn't he respond. The patrol boat's engine grew louder as it changed course, heading directly toward them. "They've spotted us," Isaac whispered, his body tensing beside Eleanor's. Micah made a split-second decision. "When I say now, both of you slip over the side. The current will carry you downstream. Make for the north bank. I'll lead them away." "You will be caught," Eleanor protested. "I am just a fisherman who lost track of time," Micah replied grimly. "They can prove otherwise. Now get ready." The patrol boat was less than 50 yards away now, its searchlight scanning the water methodically. In moments, they would be discovered. "Now," Micah ordered. Isaac moved first, sliding silently over the side into the cold river. Eleanor followed, gasping as the icy water enveloped her. The current immediately caught her, pulling her away from the boat and downstream. She fought the instinct to panic, remembering Isaac's instructions from their creek crossing days earlier. Stay calm, keep your head above water, fight the current. She could hear Micah calling out to the patrol boat, playing the role of an apologetic fisherman caught after curfew. The patrol's searchlight fixed on his boat, ignoring the two figures now drifting downstream in the darkness. The river was wider than Eleanor had anticipated, the current stronger. Her sodden clothes weighed her down, making it difficult to keep her head above water. She caught glimpses of Isaac swimming strongly nearby, but the distance between them grew as the current pulled them in slightly different directions. Just as her strength began to fail, Eleanor's feet touched something solid, a sandbar, mercifully placed in her path. She struggled to stand, the water, still chest-deep but no longer threatening to pull her under. A moment later, Isaac appeared beside her, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "This way," he whispered, guiding her toward the north bank, still some distance away. They waded through the shallower water of the sandbar before having to swim again through a final deep channel. By the time they reached the north shore, Eleanor was trembling with cold and exhaustion. Isaac helped her up the muddy bank, both of them collapsing among the reeds, gasping for breath. In the distance they could see the patrol boat S light moving away, following Micah S. craft upstream. Their desperate gamble had worked for now. "We need to keep moving," Isaac said after they had caught their breath. "The patrol will realize Micah is alone and come back to search this area." Eleanor nodded, too exhausted to speak. Her entire body felt leaden, her wet clothes clinging uncomfortably to her skin. But Isaac was right, they couldn't afford to rest yet. They made their way slowly through the riverside vegetation, heading north as planned. Without Micah to guide them, they would need to find the road to Philadelphia on their own and hope to encounter another conductor of the Underground Railroad along the way. After an hour of difficult travel through muddy terrain, they reached a road. Isaac studied their surroundings, trying to get his bearings in the unfamiliar territory. East, he finally decided. If we follow this road east, we should reach a town by morning. They walked in silence, the rain eventually stopping as the night wore on. Eleanor's wet clothes chafed with every step, and hunger gnawed at her stomach. Their supplies had been left behind in the boat. But the knowledge that they had crossed the river, putting a significant obstacle between themselves and Hargrove S. men, gave her the strength to continue. Dawn was breaking when they spotted a small farmhouse set back from the road. Smoke rose from its chimney, suggesting the occupants were already awake. "Wait here," Isaac said, guiding Eleanor to a concealed spot behind a hedgerow. "I'll see if it's safe." "Be careful," she whispered, suddenly afraid to let him out of her sight. He nodded once before approaching the farmhouse cautiously. Eleanor watched as he knocked on the door, speaking briefly with someone inside. After what seemed an eternity, he motioned for her to join him. The farmhouse belonged to a Quaker family. Wilson Sioux had been helping fugitives for over 20 years. They welcomed Eleanor and Isaac without question, providing dry clothes, hot food, and a place to rest. "You were fortunate," Mr. Wilson told them as his wife tended to Eleanor's blistered feet. "A conductor will be passing through tomorrow, taking a group north to Philadelphia. You can travel with them." "What about the river patrol?" Isaac asked. "Will they search this area?" "They might," Wilson acknowledged, "but they rarely venture this far from the river. Still, you should stay inside, away from the windows. Our neighbors are sympathetic, but strangers have been known to pass through, looking for reward money." That night, Eleanor slept in a real bed for the first time since fleeing Blackwood. The Wilsons' daughter had given up her room, insisting she was happy to sleep in the parlor. Despite her exhaustion, Eleanor found herself lying awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the farmhouse and thinking about how much her life had changed in less than a week. A soft knock at her door roused her from these thoughts. "Come in," she called quietly. Isaac entered, looking uncomfortable in borrowed clothes that were slightly too small for his tall frame. "I wanted to make sure you were all right," he said, remaining near the door. "The river crossing was difficult." "I'm fine," Eleanor assured him. "Thanks to you. I would have drowned without your help." He shook his head. "You were stronger than you realize. You would have found a way." A comfortable silence fell between them, different from the tense quiet of their journey thus far. For the first time they were relatively safe, with dry clothes and full stomachs, and the immediate threat of capture temporarily abated. "Isaac," Eleanor said hesitantly, "when we reach Philadelphia, would you consider staying, at least for a while?" He looked surprised by the question. Why? Eleanor wasn't entirely sure herself. She only knew that the thought of facing her new life alone, without the one person who understood what she had been through, was unbearable. "Because we've come this far together," she said finally. "It seems wrong to simply part ways, like strangers who happen to share a coach journey." Isaac studied her face in the dim light from the hallway. "We were not strangers," he said softly, "but we were not—" He trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. "Not what?" Eleanor pressed. "Not people who would normally choose each other as company," he finished carefully. "The circumstances that brought us together are unusual, to say the least." "Everything about my life now is unusual," Eleanor pointed out. I am a fugitive, accused of murder, with no home and no future except what I can make for myself. Normal no longer applies. A ghost of a smile touched Isaac's lips. I suppose that is true for both of us. Then will you consider it? Staying in Philadelphia, at least until we know whether Hargrove's men have followed us north. Isaac was silent for a long moment. I'll consider it, he finally said. But I make no promises. The farther north I go, the safer I'll be. It wasn't the answer Eleanor had hoped for, but it was better than an outright refusal. Thank you, she said simply. He nodded once before withdrawing, closing the door softly behind him. Eleanor lay back on the pillow, staring at the ceiling. For the first time since fleeing Blackwood, she allowed herself to think beyond immediate survival to the uncertain future that awaited her in Philadelphia. Her sister would help. Of course, Margaret had been urging Eleanor to leave Charles for years, but starting over at 25, with no money, no position, and the shadow of murder accusations hanging over her, would not be easy. And then there was Isaac, whose presence had become a strange comfort in the chaos her life had become. What was it about him that made the thought of separation so difficult? Was it merely gratitude for his protection, or something more complicated, something she wasn't ready to examine too closely? With these unanswered questions circling in her mind, Eleanor finally drifted into sleep, dreaming of a river that never ended and a northern shore she couldn't quite reach. Morning brought news that changed their plans once again. The conductor, expected to guide them to Philadelphia, had sent word that the roads were being watched. Hargrove had connections in Maryland, powerful friends who had mobilized local authorities to search for the fugitives from Virginia. You will need to take a different route, Mr. Wilson explained over breakfast. Through the Wilderness Road. It's longer and more difficult, but less likely to be watched. How much longer? Isaac asked, concern evident in his voice. 3 days, perhaps 4, Wilson replied. My son will guide you to the first safe house. From there, others will help you continue north. Eleanor's heart sank at the thought of more difficult travel, but she knew they had no choice. The alternative, capture and return to Virginia, was unthinkable. They departed at dusk, following young James Wilson along overgrown paths that wound through dense woodland. The boy, no more than 16, moved with the confidence of someone who knew these woods intimately. My father has been helping people escape since before I was born, he told them proudly as they walked. I made my first guide journey when I was 12. Eleanor marveled at the courage of this family risking everything to help strangers find freedom. It was a kind of bravery she had never witnessed in her previous life, where appearances and social position had mattered more than moral conviction. As they continued their journey through the wilderness of northern Maryland, Eleanor felt something shifting within her, not just her circumstances, but her understanding of the world and her place in it. The woman who had poured tea in the parlor of Blackwood Plantation seemed like a stranger now, a character in a story she had once read but could barely remember. Ahead lay Philadelphia, and whatever new life awaited her there. Beside her walked Isaac, his future as uncertain as her own. Behind them stretched the broken pieces of the lives they had left behind. The only certainty was the path before them, winding through the darkness toward a freedom neither of them had fully defined.